I think we're ready to roll here. I see John Hoops on the call, and Andy's here, and Holly is here. Really grateful to be back in a regenerative environment. So, if John or Holly, you'd like to take it away, we can kick off with Guild session.
Great. Yes. Hello. Hello. Can everybody hear me okay? Oh, good. Good. Thank you, Vivek. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to chapter 2 of the Regeneration Guild. We have kind of a similar workshop style kind of horizontal inquiry lesson lined up today. I hope everybody's all right. How's everybody doing? Maybe post in the chat something you did to regenerate in the last week or two since we last met. I can volunteer. I went on a long bike ride over the weekend, which was the first time I've done anything like that in a long, far too long. And it was, it's interesting, right? In the short term, it was exhausting. But somehow humans, to me, this is kind of the essence of what Nassim Nicholas Taleb means when he talks about anti-fragile, that within a kind of given level of stress, we're able to rebound and actually come back stronger. And so I'm still actually exhausted, but I think one more good night's sleep and I'll be stronger than I was before I left. Cool. Let's see who we've got around. We've got about 20 people in, maybe even a bit more. So Holly's here. Hey, Holly. And we also have a special guest to help us with workshops today, Ale Borda. So hey, Ale. Cool. We've got John, who went to the art museum with his daughter. A break away from Twitter. See, that's what I'm talking about, man. Gmo germinated. Alexandra intentionally eating really delicious foods. That's a great policy, I find. Cool. Diogo working on putting his thoughts into a slide presentation. Absolutely. Okay, so the overarching lesson today, we're going to delve into this kind of phenomenon that we witness when we start to study complex systems, which is this idea of a leverage point. This is pretty obviously common concept that everybody's going to be familiar with, but as the sort of complexity science has developed over the last decades, there's been a lot more scrutiny and rigor, kind of rigorous approach to studying how these complex systems behave, and also how to essentially affect the behavior of the systems by identifying points in the system where an action basically has like an unexpected or disproportionate reaction. So that's going to be a lot of the thinking around. Is we're going to talk about complex adaptive systems and a little bit about complexity theory. We're going to talk about leverage points. We'll talk about what is a system. I think that's a really interesting question that doesn't necessarily have a very clear answer. And then in the second half of the session, we have a workshop where we took the dimensions of regeneration that we identified last time around and have kind of broken them out into a few different areas on a Figma board. And we want to do a systems mapping exercise led by Ale, where we kind of delve in and think about what the appropriate level in the system to focus in on is, and then thinking about different agents or kind of individuals in the system and the way they interact and how resources might flow. We're not going to do a comprehensive map of all the systems in the world today in the next hour. So this is partly to kind of key in on a specific area, but it's also really around how to think like a systems theorist and how to think in terms of these complexity models, and really to kind of recognize that oftentimes, if you read the Meadows article, she made this point, like very often complex systems behave the opposite of how we expect them to behave. And so it takes quite a lot of humility to approach this, and to approach kind of making these interventions in a way that, yeah, I guess actually creates the outcomes of steering the system towards some intended state. And I think there's actually probably an even more important question that needs to be asked before we start talking about how to identify points to intervene in the system, which is, who are we to intervene, right? Under what circumstances should we be intervening? Or is that this sort of, I guess, yeah, the ethics around us sticking our kind of paws in the system and potentially messing things up more than they were before. So that, I think, is also something that I like to think a lot about. And in any case, let's go ahead and introduce Ale. For those of you who haven't met Ale, here she is. Maybe you can say a few words about yourself, Ale. Bon appetit,
Yeah, definitely.
Sorry, I caught you mid-bite, it looks like.
Oh yeah. No, you're good. I'm actually eating some acai. I didn't have the chance to eat anything until now. Yeah, I'm Ale. I'm from Peru, and I've done a lot of work before in like all areas of social impact, starting from like volunteering, building house and staircases, education, social entrepreneurship, and even some venture capital for social impact. And now, like, where I'm diving in is trying to identify where are the biggest leverage points we can actually tackle within Web3 to actually move society forward. So kind of like in having like a very, very high level or systemic view of the different frameworks or primitives or mechanisms that different DAOs and or projects are working, and how are these applied to global problems to advance society forward in the best way. So trying to do a lot of research there and see how those different insights modularly play, or other organizations can actually leverage to also start applying this to their own missions and advance them. And I'm just fascinated by trying to converge, because Web3 is so fluid and so emergent, and everyone's just like able to shift their strategy towards like the better outcome of the ecosystem. I'm fascinated by how, if we share the right information and if we share the right mental frameworks and shift our mindset towards a more of a collaborative environment, we're actually be able to converge towards the best strategies instead of trying to convince everyone that each of our individual strategy is the best one. So I really like about the fluidity of Web3 and like leveraging that.
Thank you, Ale. I heard a lot there that I liked. I think this word emergent is one we'll come back to when we start talking about complex systems. And yeah, I think we have the essence, I think, of what I heard you say is what Danella Meadows recognized as the most potent leverage point, which is our attitudes, essentially, right? Are the choices that we make and the beliefs that we hold, because those create the systems of rules and norms in which these systems operate. And we have, I don't know, I reflect a lot about how our minds aren't really subject to the laws of physics, in that this idea of, we can create, things can be in the same place at two places at once. And there's not this idea of momentum doesn't necessarily apply to ideas. We can change your mind in a second. And I think that's a really potent opportunity for us, where we have to effectively change our minds in a geologic second when it comes to climate change. And yeah, so, okay, well, let's load up the screen share. It looks like somebody else might be, it says I can't share my screen. Is there somebody who has?
Yeah, give it a go now, John.
Oh, now, yeah, cool. Okay, and we're gonna throw. All right, great. Can I just ask, can you see this new tab that I just opened, or is it stuck on the one tab?
Yep, I can see it.
Cool.
Yes.
All right. So we have a similar setup to last time. We've got a couple minutes to talk about this key question, which we're kind of already into, and then we'll go through some of the core ideas of the readings that we've done. And I think likewise, similar to last time, this is very much a collaborative and horizontal conversation. So I think we will do the similar pattern where we introduce the concept, but then pause, take questions, take insights from everyone here, because I'm sure a lot of these ideas are familiar to a lot of people. And then Ali's going to give us a little bit of an overview of this systems mapping, the flow of the systems mapping. And then we'll dive into the exercise where we'll spend about half an hour doing a bit of inquiry into these systems and potentially identifying leverage points there. And then we'll come back and report back, because we're hoping and expecting that people will be attracted to looking at different dimensions of regeneration. So we might actually get several different groups working in parallel. Right. Okay. So the key question we're looking at today is what are the key leverage points of regeneration? And as Meadows points out, and as we kind of the readings sort of illustrated, complex systems are essentially systems where I think I've got the definition on the next slide. A dynamic network of interactions where the behavior of the ensemble together may not be predictable according to the behavior of the components. So you could say this is the sum is greater than its parts, or you can't necessarily predict. If you know one entity in the system, the emergent behavior that manifests when many of these entities are interacting isn't necessarily predictable from this one example. So a key kind of concept within a complex adaptive system is the idea of an agent. And an agent is, I mean, we can use a bunch of other abstract words for it, like an actor or an entity. But typically an agent is thought of as an individual in sort of some kind of space, whether that's in a physical space, it could be in an economic space like a market, it could be in some kind of informational space like on a computer network. But it's an actor that is able to do something and typically can perceive its environment, respond to inputs from the environment, and then engage in some kind of behavior. And complex adaptive systems, the sort of one of the fields or the techniques for studying these is this field called agent-based modeling. And in agent-based modeling, you essentially design these systems, and you basically, it's typically like a algorithm or a computational approach to studying complex systems. And you will define the space that these agents exist in. You will define the rules that each agent engages in or uses to process its environment and react. And then essentially you run a series of simulations where you watch these agents interact over time and can draw out insights into potential dynamics of the system. And then with that, you can understand the way that different parameters can kind of be adjusted to impact different emergent system processes. It's very important to notice that the map is not the territory, right? The model is not the territory. So a lot of these are obviously just models running on a computer, but they can be very powerful in understanding the ways that network dynamics and system dynamics can play out over time. So another kind of common term we hear when we talk about complex systems is that they're nonlinear, dynamics. And this is just to illustrate what a nonlinear function really means. So if you think this is the x-axis and this is the y-axis, and typically this would be the independent variable and the dependent variable. In a linear system, if you increase by a set amount on one axis, then there's a predictable increase on another axis, and it's kind of proportionate each step you go up. Whereas with the nonlinear system, you get to a point where suddenly a small input on the x-axis creates a disproportionately large input on the y-axis. And a lot of complex system study and a lot of, honestly, kind of statistical modeling is designed to essentially identify the way that these kind of variables relate to each other and create mathematical models that describe them and use those to predict how these systems will work. So to kind of pull this down into like kind of something that makes sense, like it might be that one of these axes is the population of rabbits and then another axis is the population of foxes, and the more foxes there are, well, maybe there are less rabbits there are, so these are different metrics that you measure that are supposed to be indicative of some kind of state of the system. This is some graphics of some more sophisticated system models, and essentially what kind of one of the observations of the way that these complex systems work is that they kind of get into these like sort of range bound, not quite equilibrium, but there's like a sort of zone in which they operate. Like you imagine if you've got this foxes and rabbits example, if there's way more foxes than rabbits at the outset of a system, then the foxes just eat all the rabbits and then all the foxes will die and that'll be the end of it. And if there's way more rabbits than foxes, eventually the rabbits population will just explode and overrun the whole system, and maybe foxes will continue to grow, but they won't be. But then if the proportions of those two kind of start out at an appropriate level, a balanced level, you can end up where like the rabbit population rises and that causes the fox population to rise, which then more foxes hunt the rabbits. So, and you end up with this kind of equilibrium. In complex systems theory, that's called an attractor. And this is an example of some of these more sophisticated attractors where you end up with this sort of kind of rhythmic cyclical dynamic within the system. Don't want to go too deep into this, but this is kind of some of the basics of complex adaptive systems. So Holly, is there anything you want to add onto this before we have people jump in with a couple of questions or their own inputs here?
I think I'll show maybe the next slide where it actually shows the leverage points and kind of the fulcrum. Yeah, maybe if you want to move over there.
Cool.
Yeah. So I love this diagram because I think it shows, the system is on the left, right? And it shows that first basically leverage point grouping called constants, parameters, numbers to the left of the basically to the left of the fulcrum. So it's actually a lot of times that's the number one thing people are adjusting is that first constants, parameters, and numbers. And actually that's worsening, right? The system is basically going down negatively. And whereas as you move to the far right there, then you can start seeing that just even a small, just a light amount of effort in changing mindset or paradigm would have a huge effect on the system. So I think that's kind of all I wanted to say there is, this is just a really nice diagram for showing that. So, yep.
I also,
Alec.
touching on exactly on that, I really like the idea of, I think you also showed it in this diagram, like identifying the areas where it will create rippling effects on the entire system. I really like the idea of thinking of leverage points, kind of like I can show it in the chat, but it's like kind of like acupuncture points where it's like small areas within our bodies that can actually create rippling effects on the entire systems, and they're like really, really small and precise. So if we can also achieve that, that's like much better than mostly what we do when we intervene or where we put in solutions. We actually try to solve the most obvious symptoms instead of trying to solve the underlying symptoms causing the problem in the first place. And that you can relate it to health, to the environment, to everything for example, if it's with health, you're trying to improve, like you're trying to treat more disease with like pills that like lower down your glucose or acidity, when in reality you need to shift your nutrition and like improve metabolic health. So it's kind of like identifying those leverage points within it.
Brilliant. Yeah. And I think to speak for a second as to why we're talking about leverage points, it's really about us being considerate in where we strategically place our efforts as we're trying to move our systems towards building a more regenerative world, right? Exactly as I said, if we spend all of our time striking at the symptoms, as I think it was, what was the name? Thoreau, something about striking at the branches of the problem when we should be focusing our energy at the roots. That's a leverage point, for example. So let's have people go ahead and jump in the Figma. If you don't have a link, we can share it in the chat here in a second. And let's just spend a few minutes generating some questions and some insights into this leverage point slide and this complex adaptive system slide, thinking about nonlinearities, thinking about the emergent patterns that we can't predict from understanding each of the components, maybe brainstorming some systems. Just go ahead and drop anything that came to mind as Holly, Ale, and I were talking over the last 10 minutes. And we'll take a few minutes just to gather some insights from the crowd, and then we'll review, and then we'll talk a little bit about Hollands. Great. Okay, let's take 4 or 5 minutes. Okay, we got about 30 more seconds on this little section of the exercise. Great. All right. Holly, maybe we just kind of go one by one and read off a couple of the observations we like. Let's start over here on the complex adaptive systems page. And everyone can hear all right? Yeah, cool. Okay. Okay, we've got some really interesting insights here. This idea of the death or sunsetting of old structures and the birth of new structures. I think this is a fascinating one, and I would encourage people to take a look at this idea of the two loops model, which is a really interesting approach to thinking about how to transition from an old system into a new system in a dignified way. This is this idea of, yeah, there's this old paradigm and people are then kind of building this new paradigm, but there are people stuck in the old one, and we want to kind of help educate and manage this transition into this new paradigm and create a strong new normal as this other one kind of subsides. So that deals with this idea of the death of old structures and the birth of new structures in a graceful way. Yeah, here's even like this two loops visual kind of medieval era sunsetting into the modern era, which is now sunsetting into the integral era. Here, can we engineer solutions encompassing the entire system or individual aspects of it that can be stacked modularly? Because a great question, Ali, and we can circle back to that on the next section when we talk a bit about Hollands. Holistic systems versus symptomatic treatments. I almost think of this as like preventative versus reactive medicine. I think that's really interesting. And then, yeah, some thinking on the graphs of the complex systems, chaotic and organized. What do the attractors represent within the experience of agents? You know what? I actually think about this specific one a lot. This is called the Aizawa attractor. And the way I kind of think of this is, if you were to think of like this as a three-dimensional graph, and each dimension is its own measure of, even just say like the relative populations of different species. When you're in the outside of this graph, that means as time passes, there's huge swings in the relative numbers of species, which I basically interpret to just mean carnage. There's just like huge population boom followed by a huge bust on this dimension, and then likewise on this one as it goes up and down. But when it hits this tipping point and kind of transitions into a much tighter kind of pattern, that is a much more kind of stable, harmonious system that is not swinging quite so wildly. And I think of that in the context of the system we're in now and how we've reached or appear to be reaching a tipping point and transitioning to what I feel inevitably will be a new stable state, at least in some way. And now the questions we should be asking ourselves are, how do we manage this transition so that we minimize the amount of harm and suffering that's created? And what are the systems that are there, probably governance systems that are there to catch humanity on the other side so that we can end up in a stable state that can kind of continue to operate in this balanced way for long into the future. Cool. Let's have Holly, would you be up for reading a couple of these as I can kind of scroll around on the leverage points piece?
Yes, I'm here. Okay,
Great.
so it might be worth okay, we already discussed this on Ale. Regarding mindset, what does it take to shift mindset and therefore paradigms? We got social factors, personal factors, cultural factors, education and systems. So I think that's, yeah, and I think that we have several projects or adventures in kernel that are doing this. I'm thinking right now about Pact DAO and kind of the work that they're doing with the with just first meeting with the community and trying to understand kind of from the ground up what sort of things do people want to change rather than forcing people to act a certain way or do a certain thing. So. Anything, Ale, that you want to?
I actually had my question in mind, which I included, I think, in the middle. It's related to like the old structures that that John just tackled like a few minutes ago. But I have this sense of like how nature has the ability to regenerate itself on its own, but we have moved away because of efficiency. We have moved away from balance so much that maybe like there's some fixing we actually need to do. And like I always struggle with like how much energy or focus should we be putting into building these new thriving systems like eco villages from scratch, new economies like without the dollar, stuff like that, versus trying to fight the solve current problems. Like should we be continuously fighting for climate change, like removing carbon while bringing in the other regenerative systems, or like poverty, for example? Like should we continue to try to bring economic development or start from scratch and enable these different communities to do their own impact economy from scratch? So to what extent should we focus our efforts, and if that's like a valid question to ask as well?
That's really good point. That brings to mind the Doug Rushkoff video that is part of the kernel book, and he talks about how narrative structures are shifting from this kind of ABCD arc to now with like series, we have these more braiding, pluralistic, kind of multi-threaded narratives. And I think that's actually a lot more reflective of the way the world works, right? Like I think in a way, starting from scratch is kind of an illusion, right? There is no scratch. We're always starting from the moment before, no matter what we do. So I feel like it's probably a both and personally, that these are always parallel efforts. And it's kind of, this was also one of the insights I think we got to in the last session, was people have different value sets, and that's okay. And people should be empowered to pursue the promotion of their own value set within kind of reason, obviously, because something that's important to you might not be important to me, but that doesn't mean that both of those things don't need to kind of be regenerated or improved. And that was actually sort of the thesis that led to identifying these different dimensions of regeneration. Cool. If anybody, by the way, wants to unmute and just kind of jump in and say something or tell us we're missing something or anything, please do. Let's go ahead and keep looking on. Actually, yeah, Dom, so I saw this. I don't know, curious about Taleb's idea of the power of the intolerant minority. I'm not familiar with that idea. Can you give us a quick summary?
I can do my best. I remember reading about it for like 3 years ago, and then just it came up when I was thinking about this, which is essentially that, like, you don't need to convince the majority if you have a minority that has a really strong opinion about something and a majority that has a less strong opinion about something. And a good example of this is like, if you're like ordering food to be catered, and for some reason you can only get one dish, and you have one vegan, like hardcore vegan, in a group of 10 people, probably everyone's just going to end up eating vegan, because there aren't really people in the group that are like, no, I only eat meat, unless you're doing the carnivore diet or something. But this shows up in other aspects where if you have a small group of people that are embedded in the system that absolutely will not compromise, there are circumstances in which their opinions end up being overvalued, or they're able to like shift the phase of the system, which can have positive or negative effects.
That's interesting. Yeah, I would suspect that there are multiple ways in which they impact leverage points, right? If you had some kind of organization and there was one kind of person that had power that was intolerant to change, and like even just changing their mind becomes a leverage point, right? But that also probably affects the dynamics of the system around them. So yeah, that's really interesting. And I think, yeah, I remember learning about this observation that essentially these kind of social justice movements, they hit a sort of tipping point when some relatively small proportion of the population agrees with a particular movement, like LGBT rights, this kind of thing. And once they hit that tipping point, then it kind of, these changes happen quite quickly on the level of, the example I was looking at was national governments. So that's also an interesting idea. This a very closely related concept to leverage points is this idea of the tipping point, right? Where you reach that point of non-linearity where things start changing much faster than they had been based on relatively kind of similar inputs. What does it take to shift mindset and paradigm? I think that's a really great question. Does changing incentives do this? And what is the sort of limitation of changing incentives? I think that's really interesting. Leverage as a linear and analogy for a non-linear system. That's an interesting observation for sure. Indigenous people would, with legacy food forests for their children, we don't have that culture. That's fundamentally a feeling of continuation that we've lost. Interesting. How do we sync and prove effective and accurate information flows? That's a great question, Laura. And that was a point that Meadows raised, is that one of these leverage points is information flows. How do we communicate across a system? And to me, the internet is fundamentally a system for communication. So that's definitely affecting the global kind of human systems we have. Brilliant. Okay, well, let's jump back for a second and just take a quick second to talk about Hollands, because I think it's quite an interesting concept that points to what I see as a deeper truth, which is that to talk about different systems is a bit of a, well, a holon is something that is simultaneously a whole in and of itself, as well as part of a larger whole. So this is a concept that was introduced by a philosopher called Arthur Koestler. I first encountered this concept when I was reading a philosopher called Ken Wilber, who has this really interesting theories where he's studied all of these different knowledge domains and then tried to create this unifying, what he calls integral theory, that kind of accommodates everything. And I think for me, it's really quite interesting because it makes room for both the kind of empirical or very like objective reality, but also subjective reality, like the way that I feel, my belief systems or social structures that sometimes are left out of the more scientific reductionist approaches to explaining the world. But one of the key kind of primitives, I guess you could say, in this theory is this idea of a holon. So essentially, a holon, another way to describe it, is something that's a whole and a part of a whole. And I think that everything is a holon, basically. Anything you can name is a holon. So here's an example from within a physical organism, right? An individual organism. You have a single body, right? My body. My body is composed of a bunch of parts. You could draw the distinction between the parts at organs. Organs are composed of cells. Cells are composed of molecules, and molecules are composed of atoms. This is essentially, it comes down to where do you draw the boundary? right? We draw the boundary in our minds between my body as a whole versus like, where does my liver start and end? Where does my heart start and end? Also applied to other systems. So administrative political jurisdictions are Hollands in a way. They are, here's Greater London where I live. That's a administrative jurisdiction that's part of England. And then that's also part of Great Britain or the United Kingdom, which is part of Europe, some would say. And then in turn, Greater London is composed of something like 33 boroughs like Islington and Haringey, and those boroughs are composed of individual postcodes and all the way down to individual land parcels. So, and that's, you could zoom up to the world, the solar system. This is kind of like physical or administrative jurisdictions. Here's an idea of Hollands applied to an organizational structure. So you could have different departments that are parts of different branches, and then the branches are part of a larger organization, and each one of these departments has sub-departments, and then there are individuals working in the sub-departments. And so essentially the reason I raise this is because I would argue that each one of these kind of layers or levels in this hierarchy, or what Ken Wilber calls a holarchy, you could argue that this is its own system, right? So in my body, my liver is a subsystem, and each cell within my liver is its own subsystem. And then there are subsystems within the cells, like the different, I don't know, what are they called? Mitochondria and Golgi apparatus, and et cetera, et cetera. And so we pointed out this idea of micro, meso, and macro to just essentially bring awareness to us being thoughtful about what level in a holarchy or in a system we're looking at, being conscious of the subsystems that are contained within a system, and then also being conscious of the super systems that particular system is a subsystem of. So in the case of the body, I'm a member of my family, or a member of my community, or a member of a political community. That I think is an important just thing to be aware of, I suppose. Anything there to add, Holly and Ale? Starting with Holly, maybe.
No, not too much more. I'm just thinking of some other things right now. So
okay.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Cool. Ale?
I was just thinking that if we add thought and consciousness and how that impacts our atoms and molecules, that will give a whole new boundary to that body hollow.
Yeah. Well, and I think Wilbur's idea would be that this kind of exists in the physical dimension, and then the mind and emotions and words and symbols exist in another kind of quadrant of his 4-quadrant plane that he uses to describe reality. But yeah, absolutely. And like, it's tricky, right? Because these boundaries only exist in our minds, but that doesn't mean that they're not real. And so we've got this sort of tension between accepting that it's really helpful to delineate between what's inside of a system and what's outside of a system, so we can study system dynamics. But at the end of the day, every system is part of the universe in this moment. And that goes all the way up. So, right, maybe let's take even just a few minutes here to just kind of splat up some ideas of anything that this brings to mind, or questions or things that don't make sense. Just a couple more stickies and we'll do a quick review there, and then we'll move on to getting started with we got a couple more little slides on this, and then we'll get on to our systems dynamic workshop. Cool. Yeah, let's do like 4 minutes maybe. Great. All right, great. We have a number of questions that are very thought-provoking. Holly, would you choose a couple to read?
Yes. Let's see. Can you scroll down so I can, or maybe I'll switch.
Zoom in a little.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah. Is it frozen for everybody else, John's screen?
It's frozen for me, yeah.
Okay, all right.
There
Oh,
we
there we
go.
go. Okay. All right. So, so where are we in the layer stack of the universe? Yeah, let's just keep going. That's quite a, is it right to purposely shift others' mindsets? Can we accept diversity of thought and others' levels of growth? I'm still trying to kind of like understand hold on. So, I still don't have a full understanding of it really, but from a regeneration point of view, I'm trying, who's the Holland? If we go scroll down a little bit more, can any system see itself as a Holland, right? And so this concept of regeneration is when we are able to, in that initial graph that you're showing is we're working through all of those the smaller systems, right? We're having an effect on everything, right? As we that's when we have full regeneration, is when we can change all those aspects of the whole on. Does that sound like kind of what you're thinking, John, or not?
I mean, I don't, this is not something I have an answer to. I think, yeah, I mean, I think of most everything you could think of as a holon. I guess it would be curious to see if anybody could come up with an example of something that is not a holon. But then the next question is, well, how do you assess the health of a particular individual or entity or a holon? And how do you measure that? And is that an effective way of measuring it? And I think is really a really interesting question was asked down here, which reminded me, and it might help illustrate the holon concept, which is, to what degree do we respect individual parts of the holon versus try to change the parts because they affect the whole? And this, to me, I think if you haven't watched the Sepp Kamvar Fireside, please do go watch that. In that fireside, he was talking about this balance between individualism and community, essentially. Like the individual is a part of the community is composed of individuals. A community also could be thought of as an individual community in a community of other communities. And that to me is in large part the essence of some of Wilber's lessons, is that we have to accept that we're kind of at once an individual and a member of a community, and that we should embrace this sort of spectrum of what Sepp kind of described as like individual agency and kind of my own individual purpose, while also balancing that with the health and well-being of the community, and finding systems that kind of promote the well-being of all of them in harmony. That's, I think, the essence of what they're trying to do at Cello. And to me, honestly, that's a lot of what I think my take on this regeneration movement is, to sort of find the right balance there. Cool. Ale, do you want to read a couple? In the meantime, is a decentralized ledger an example of a holon? I would say so. And the blockchain is the consensus network is a whole network, but it's also composed of parts, which are the nodes. Each of these nodes are individual wholes in and of themselves that are composed of parts. Yeah, definitely. Ale, are you available to read a few, or are you still eating your acai? Okay, it looks like she's still busy. If we live out of the context story that we are separate, we are doomed. When we realize that every human is just a small part of the whole and we are connected to everything, we can start to understand our impact in the world. Absolutely. I've been making my way through Charles Eisenstein's book, Sacred Economics, over the last weeks, and that's another one I really recommend. And he really leans into this concept of we have this belief that we're separate, and it's a tricky thing, right? Because in a way we are, and in a way we're not. The boundary between you and me exists, but it only exists in our mind, but that doesn't mean it's not real. And so there's a bit of a paradox there, where we need to sort of make room and accept that in one interpretation we are separate, but at the end of the day we're all part of this same moment in the same universe, and that means that we have something very real that we're sharing. How porous borders can exist inside holons. Ecotones, the transitional area of vegetation between two different plant communities. That's a really, really great question. That's a really great question. That's probably just one we're gonna have to ponder. Cool. I'm conscious that we've got about a half hour left. So wow, there's still so many more to read. I think let's move on. And I mean, this is part of the exercise here, is like so much with Kernel, we're creating so much more than we can possibly absorb in one go. So this will be available and we can revisit these questions in the future. Okay, so we're going to get into now talking a bit about this systems mapping exercise that Ale is going to lead us through. And a big part of it is kind of building from the ground up. So Ale, are you available on the audio yet? It doesn't look like it. I don't know if anybody's seen Ale or heard from Ale. Okay, well, Holly, maybe we can jump in and take this while Ale hopefully sorts herself out.
Yes.
Cool. Do you want to try to explain this system state and the inflows and outflows concept?
Maybe you should go ahead and work
Okay.
on this one. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, the essence here is that there's a lot of different tools or kind of heuristics that we use to look at and understand systems. And typically a system is described as it has a particular state, which is more or less the sort of configuration of agents and resources at a particular point in time. And over time, these agents interact and they consume resources, or resources flow in and flow out, and that can kind of create different conditions and experiences for these agents. If we replace this idea of agents with people, it can maybe become a little bit kind of closer to home. But in an example of, okay, you've got a community that lives near a forest, and there is an amount of timber that's in the forest, or a number of trees in the forest, and there's a balance between maintaining a healthy forest, but also harvesting enough wood for them to be able to provide shelter for themselves and fuel for their cooking and heating and so forth. In that kind of simple system, you could describe these resources in terms of stocks and flows. Stock would be the amount of a particular resource that's held in a particular area, and the flow would be the rate at which the resource is replenished and the rate at which the resource is kind of taken away. And this diagram essentially shows that the state, as I said, is the sort of kind of configuration of resources and agents at a particular point in time. And as time moves forward, resources flow in, resources flow out, agents move out. And the idea with identifying these leverage points is that there's some kind of goal state that you want to move towards. So in the case of the forest, it might be, we want, to be growing more wood than we're harvesting, so that the forest is regenerating itself and constantly kind of growing. And you might kind of perceive or recognize that at the moment, more wood is being harvested than is growing each year. And that means that over time, it's deteriorating the size of the forest, or exhausting the forest resource. So this would be, you would identify this discrepancy between where you want to be and where you are, and then use that as an opportunity to essentially try to toggle or identify these leverage points where you can move things towards the goal state. So this is just like a small little component of what could be a broader stock and flow diagram that shows the stocks of resources and the ways that they flow between themselves. And so this is kind of a key little piece of understanding how to map a system. Yeah, here's another diagram we've just pulled in. It's actually an economic example, but you've got investment, that's an inflow of money. There's capital pool, that's, and then there's depreciation, some kind of outflow of value. And then this can be used to invest in resource extraction, which then can be used to produce some kind of good or service that then can be sold on the market, and that profit can flow back in as investment into the capital pool. You can kind of see these stocks of capital and resources and the flows of money or the resource itself. And then these arrows are kind of interaction points or ways in which those kind of can be converted into each other and so forth. I'm not sure if I'm doing the best job of explaining this, but hopefully that gives you a bit of a sense of the ways these systems and complexity scientists think about system dynamics, and as we start to map this stuff out. Brilliant. Okay, we've got one other point here, which is identifying leverage points in the system. So very often a system is described in a network diagram, and network diagram typically is formed of what are called nodes and links. Nodes are usually represent different agents in the system. So this could be people, this could be computers on a network, this could be it could be, you know, businesses or companies in a market. And links are interactions between these nodes. They're connections between the nodes and connections. And as we do these system mapping exercise, a lot of times we'll think about the different nodes or agents in a system and the way that they relate or kind of the way they're interconnected, and that allows you to identify, for example, okay, this is a central node in the system where there's a lot of connections coming into it. So that might be a leverage point, because if you can change something there, that might have a disproportionate impact on a large kind of part of the network. So there's a little bit of kind of prioritization exercise you can do, which essentially has to do with the ease at which doing something is, and the impact that it will have. And obviously, this is almost like the important and urgent, or not even really, but if it's easy and it's high impact, that's what we should probably focus on. If it's hard and low impact, don't do it. If it's easy but low impact, that's going to be probably worth pursuing because it's low hanging fruit. And if it's high impact but difficult, then it's worth figuring out, but it's identifying key barriers. If you bring down a barrier, that's going to mean it marches up the doability spectrum. It might kind of fall into one of these more desirable quadrants. Impact is defined as having clear positive outcomes and scalability, and ease of doing something or doability. It takes leadership and a team and resources. And this readiness piece actually kind of has to do with the mindset or paradigm. So that might be its own kind of leverage point in and of itself. All right, brilliant. So I'm not sure if Ale is here yet. Ale, are you back?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, brilliant. Great. Okay, cool. So let's take a few minutes just for you to walk through this flow of systems mapping. Maybe you should share so you can kind of zoom around. What do you think?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Okay.
Cool. Can you see my screen, right?
Yes.
Perfect. So I think like a key thing when we're thinking about systems mapping, it's, well, first we're gonna identify like one key area, one key question we want to tackle. For example, like how do we include like increase of biodiversity in our solutions, or how do we here, for example, it's like how do we improve the ecological aspects of the fashion industry, like in this specific example. So we kind of like choose a specific question. How might we enable this, or how might we achieve this? And then like from there, we just like place that in the middle. That's it. Yeah, the question, the problem we want to solve in the middle. And then we kind of take 5 minutes or 10 minutes actually to brainstorm influential factors that have an impact on this on this problem, or on this underlying factor we want to change. And for example, like here in this example, it's like the participants thought about like the different aspects within the fashion industry, within ecological impacts, the consumer behavior, and within like some specific areas like the developing markets. And like when you map the different actors that kind of like have an impact on the problem or in the factor you want to change, like you are thinking about institutions, about companies, about even like measure methods, So like anything is fair game. It doesn't have to be like a specific person, a specific organization. It can be also be like tactics or mechanisms or strategies, but that affect the system. And you just like place them like around the core question that we were trying to tackle. Here there's like a simpler map of like how you see like where you're trying to improve like the literacy of like children, for example. Like you have like the church faiths, you have foster parents, employees, schools, parks. So like it's very random. And the thing is, like, once you have all these different players within the system, you take a step back and you try to draw connections between them. We try to do like positive flows and negative flows, and some that are neutral for the ones we don't know. And for example, here, and we don't try to find any solution. We just try to analyze and have a picture of the current system and how it's working. So we absolutely like just step away from trying to solution it or trying to come up with some better strategy. Just like analyze how the system is right now currently, so we can actually then take a step back and change it. So that's like a key mental model of like, we're not trying to like find something to shift, find which leverage point we're going to tackle. We're just trying to map down the current system, so that then we can enable to like our brains to continue thinking about it and continue ideating possibilities. And for example, here the like what this system mapped was that, like, looking at the different value flows, a lot of them were like pointing towards the amount of discarded clothes. And when you actually see that a ton of pointers or arrows are pointing to a specific problem, then it was that they took a step back and realized that the amount of discarded clothes was due to improving the durability of clothes. And that's where the solution here comes in on like, how do we increase the durability of clothes? So like I talked a lot right now, but like kind of like to summarize, like what we'll do is we'll choose a question or a key topic we want to change within the system. Then we're going to brainstorm every factor that's influencing the central element. Then we take 5 minutes to draw connections between these different factors to the central element and also between each other. It's going to be much easier once you take everything on the paper. And then once we draw the connections without any solutions, we take a step back and we kind of gather together, see what we have observed. And then we start answering like, okay, what would we want to change and leverage? And usually this is like 2 rounds of the same thing to actually nail down, but here we're only going to do 1 round for the sake of time.
Oh,
I don't know if
okay.
good.
That's great, Ali. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, so just as a reminder, we have these 5 different dimensions of regeneration: organizations, community, earth, individual, and interspecies. And we've got about 25 of us, so we'll all hang out in the same room. We're gonna just go through this exercise that Ali just described and essentially kind of do one of these brainstorming divergent phase of the design process where we pop up everything we can think of on each particular board, and then we'll come back and kind of touch base about it in a few minutes. Cool. Okay, so let's set a timer for maybe 7 minutes. And yeah, so we're gonna brainstorm factors that influence a central element. And this might even include taking the first 3 minutes and just going through each board and popping up what you think are the central elements in each one of these dimensions. And if you are particularly interested and want to focus on one dimension, spend all your time on one board, that's fine. If you also want to pop around and see what everybody else is doing, that's fine. So let's start with 3 minutes to just to brainstorm the central elements that we think are key to these particular domains. And then we'll come back and we'll do the first one, 10 minutes, brainstorming factors that influence that central element. Cool. Let's set a timer for 4 minutes and go and swing through and pop up what we think are central elements.
Remember, we have like Earth, organizations, individual, and interspecies. So feel free to jot down your thoughts on like each of them or any of them that you feel more called to. I think we might be ready to choose a factor or an element. Does anyone feel very excited about one specific one?
I really like this stack in the community section of shared problems, shared history, and shared resources. I think that's an interesting one to delve into. Shared reality, yeah, definitely.
And how do we enable a shared vision of, like, what would the key element to shift? How do we enable a shared vision of, like, a shared problems, so that how do we incorporate a shared shared reality into how we design the systems, kind of thing?
I think it would be interesting to brainstorm some factors that we feel will influence this, right? Like what, you know, even down to simple as like resource, you know, because I mean, shared resources, that's another way to interpret that is to think about commons, you know. So what factors influence the commons and our kind of access and use to them, and the way they diminish or replenish, and you know, that might be the basis of this. And remember that we're really trying to, just as a reminder, we're trying to avoid finding solutions. We're just thinking about system dynamics right now, right?
Okay, I love that shared commons aspect, and also speaks, I was going to say, to the universal layer of, like, holos, and that being like a universal earth, and like thinking about complex systems with everything in between. Let's try that. So let's take these shared resources or shared reality into, and we're gonna jump into here. Oh, sure. Well, there we go. And everyone can just, like, take a few, we can take a few minutes to, in this one, in this screen number 6, and actually map the different factors or the different elements that it would influence shared commons, shared resources between everyone, and how we kind of, like, how we act and operate in our daily lives with our mindsets towards shared resources, and anything that might influence our interaction with that concept. no solutioning. Even I try to jump into solutioning, and just like, yeah, try to, maybe people can, it's gonna be quite messy. Maybe we can try for people to say out loud whatever they're putting. I don't know if that works, so that we don't have duplicates. Or you can just like be looking around, and I can, yeah, let's just everyone jot down everything, and we'll take care of trying to put things together if there's duplicates, while everyone's including post-its. Also remember, it's not just about what are our shared resources, but also just like what influences shared or not shared resources and our concepts around it, or things that enable this. So yeah, I am seeing a lot of like governance structures, which are awesome, boundaries, narrative and language, knowledge repositories. These are like also like kind of going into the solution. So what are the things that allow us to think about shared resources as caring for shared resources? Okay, I think we can shift. If you have a few more, just like jot them down. But if not, we can actually take the markers, like I don't know if you can see my screen, but like the little markers, and draw arrows between the different post-its. We can try, if you're able to do so, try to do like green for the positive flows and red for the negative flows, and no, orange. Just not use red. Red is for like, and then black if it's like neutral or you cannot think, or you're not sure. But only if you want to. You could also keep it simple and just leave it at black. And hopefully we're gonna see some areas with many arrows pointing towards them. Okay, while we're doing well, people keep drawing out arrows or something. Anyone had any observations or any thoughts on how maybe their thoughts were kind of like related to someone else's element that they hadn't thought about before, and how that enabled you to actually see differently how we could enable this, or anything that I don't know if that made much sense, but any takeaways or observations from the current map we have?
Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. Love is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. Love is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails.
Okay, I think we can take the next. I think we're over time, but just a couple of key insights or thoughts. I really like these perceptions of value of shared resources. That really stuck out to me, and how that relates to, what is this? Oh, I don't know if that's me. And then, well, of course, it's really cool to see like public goods being so connected. I think like that also relates a lot to how like our perception of like the public goods we want to grow, we want to support, or we want to build, have like a ton of impact on like the reward system, or like the different areas of like shared resources we have, as well as like local or global currencies by the community that were listed here, and how that relate to like the different aspects of how we live everyday life. And also I really like the common understanding one as well, related to boundaries, like what is, like, to what extent are we sharing resources, or to what extent are those like do we have a common understanding that the earth is like beyond our own houses or in our backyards, and like in to all living systems, including forests, including everything that we're throwing away. And that also includes like the incentives and the externalities here. And there was one of incentives here, but now it's moved, incentives for sharing, or incentives or reward systems for like how do those. So those were like some of them, the ones that stuck out to me.
Where you started with that perception of value of shared resources, it feels like that also kind of feeds back up into this whole idea of public goods and the value that we start to put on these shared resources or public goods, that then feeds into these potential kind of local and international and global currencies, and sort of the way that we start to assign value to these resources, and both in the way that we fund them, but then also in the way that we, I think, can potentially provide value to those that use the public goods. I almost wanted to see an arrow coming back down to the public goods from up above too. It's like we're assigning value to it one direction, but I think there's this potential to drive that value back to the people that are actually utilizing public goods, so that we have these like holistic circles.
Oh, I like that. Like having a more of a common understanding. So actually we're kind of, maybe it's tailored because we focus the conversation so much on leverage points, but like we're focusing on the mental aspect of like the value we see in these public goods and in these shared resources, in terms of like the value we see in them, but also relating that back to like the value these enable to the community. And from there, it's like a very strong feedback loop of like the more value these enable for the community and for living, the more value we're gonna see in them, and the more this value is gonna impact the incentives, the externalities, or the reward systems, or the governance structures that allow us to actually have a better care and common understanding of these public goods. Any other takeaways? I know, Christina, you were also putting a lot of different ideas in there, and connections, and the audio.
Was that a question?
Oh, if you had any observations or takeaways, or things that stood out to you.
Yeah, very much the sort of coming into an understanding of the shared resources through through connections that we might, there's something about I'm having a hard time even articulating. Like for me, it really is about identifying new understandings of things that we don't recognize as resources, as actually resources. And I think that is arrived at best through a community that understands it's like the cultures that it's a part of already, and even going forward to articulate new language towards describing the function of that.
I love that. like understanding what are the shared resources. Skip my dog. That's my dog.
One quick comment is I feel like we are very rich on resources here in our digital field, but we are dealing with a lack of resources in the real life ground. So we must be aware that we are in a moment of potential area for creating new resources, but we are kind of poor in the real world.
Agreed. Because I think a lot about poop. And I feel like it is definitely a hidden resource, and it's one that's going to help us sort of identify the pathways to identifying these hidden resources that we think we are only poor by our lack of awareness of these hidden resources.
Yeah. Well, just to like as a note, we can keep sharing if anyone wants to, but also just like keeping aware of the time. The main goal of this is actually not to come up with a solution right now, because these take a lot of time and a lot of tries and a lot of different contexts and further research or further analysis of the system, but rather to actually shift our mindset or our way of looking at things, of how do we come up with new solutions, how do we address the problems we see, and just like shifting our mindsets towards looking at the system as a whole, and like maybe possibly exploring some underlying factors that we had not considered before, and other perspectives and other value flows to actually create new solutions to change the systems. And then if anyone, Vincent, Madison, John, anyone has any other thoughts, feel free to come in and jump in and comment. And if anyone also has to jump off to the next call, also feel free to do, and come back to this board during the week or anything to see what inspires you, or any further thoughts that come up from seeing this.
Amazing. Great.
I learned a lot. Thank you. I learned so much. Thank you.
Good. We have another session next week, the third chapter. So stay tuned for that. We'll hopefully let you all know the exact time with a little bit more notice, because I know some people had to weren't able to adjust to this. And Ale, thank you so much for leading this workshop. And yeah, this is, there's a reason why they're called complex systems, because they're complex, and it really takes a lot of thought to break them down and kind of identify these different factors in the system and how they interrelate. But as I said, this is a strategic way of approaching how we can make this shift in the amount of time that we are expected to make it. Holly, any closing thoughts you want to leave us with?
The only one thing that I was thinking a lot about is the fisheries, and they're kind of this concept of, as fewer and fewer fish are available, that the price of fish go up. But because of inequality, we actually that never happens. Where the point where fishing stops, because there's certain people that have plenty of money that they don't even care how much of a bluefin tuna costs, right? And so this, if we can fix the inequality, we can fix a lot of these other issues. And so that was just one thought I had.
This is a key point, how to connect our systems of value exchange with the true cost of producing the goods that we consume. And I think this is kind of in a way what interspecies money is pointing towards, and natural capital backed currencies and local currencies. It all has to do with thinking about what's valuable and how we can make money more accurately reflect